The next step in the Lose Change 1969 Camaro project was to run all of the electrical wiring and air conditioning and cooling system wiring and plumbing so that we could test fit everything in the car before final assembly.
So we started mapping out the electrical system on the Lose Change Camaro. What we did here is we started with a American Autowire Classic update harness, and the reason we started there is because the Classic update harness gives you more circuits and modern ATC fuses instead of the old glass fuses, so that when you do fuel injection or a big stereo or something out of the normal 69 Camaro restoration, you have an electrical system that's designed to handle that. As is typical around here though, we're doing above and beyond what the Classic updates harness is meant to do. So right now I'm working on repinning the bulkhead connector to add some things. We got a boost gauge, oil temperature gauge, because we really want to make sure we're keeping an eye on this LSA motor so that if something does go wrong, we can shut it off in time. Some of the cool things about the Classic update harness is every wire has got a label what it's supposed to do, and that's traced on every few inches, so that if you need to change something or in the future you need to find a problem with an electrical system, it's much easier to trace, because as you can see there's a whole bunch of orange wires or a whole bunch of red wires, because there's just not enough colors to go around for all the functions in the car. Some of the other things I like about the Classic update harness is it's terminated at the fuse box, and a few of the major things like the headlight switch is terminated for you. But most of the connections, they give you a bag full of the proper terminals for 69 Camaro and extra wire. So you can route the wires differently than GM may have, so you can hide them or you can relocate components where GM didn't put them, so you can have a cleaner install.
We'll be running a Dakota Digital VHX gauge system in this car, which allows us to monitor a whole bunch of different functions. And Dakota makes add-on modules to add even more functionality to the dash panel. We mounted some of these extra modules in the original glove box location. We took the opportunity to repurpose the Camaro's ashtray location and turn that into a place to put the power center for the LSA, engine controller, and power. So basically you flip down the ashtray door and you can reach in and get access to an additional fuse panel which powers the engine, the ECM, also things like the fuel pump relays. But it's installed in a place that's easy to get to. You don't have to dig around under the hood. The supercharger on the LSA obviously takes up more space than, say, the carburetor did on the original engine, and a lot of that space is towards the firewall. So we wanted to do a couple things. We wanted to clean the firewall up to make it look nice, but we also wanted to gain extra space for the supercharger housing. So we moved the wiper motor to a different location. In order to do this, we closed up the hole in the firewall and opened a new hole in an area underneath where the driver fender is going to be. And then we modified the wiper linkage so that it was longer and corrected the geometry so that our linkage assembly worked just like factory. We did add a Detroit Speed 7-speed wiper motor, so now the car has delay wipers like a new car. If you've driven an old car in the rain without delay, you know, it's no fun to constantly turn the wipers on and turn them off and then, you know, do that whole deal. So now we've got delay wipers and a clean firewall. Now this engine's going to make a lot of power, which means it can make a lot of heat, plus the fact we've got air conditioning and the supercharger. So in order to keep this whole thing cool, we're using a radiator from C&R Racing. And these guys make stuff for NASCAR, so we know it works. It's designed to handle, I guess, around 1,000 horsepower. This thing should be making in the 630 range, so I think we'll be okay there. But a neat feature of the C&R radiator is that in the same unit as the radiator, they've incorporated a cooler for the power steering fluid and also an engine oil cooler. And these are also on thermostats. To get better airflow, we opened the hole in the core support to expose more of the radiator to fresh air. And then we added an original style lip to that hole so that maybe it looked like it was factory, you know, who knows. And we started by mounting that new radiator behind the core support. Trevor made some bracketry out of 16 gauge steel. He formed kind of a box-shaped shelf and punched a bunch of holes in it with our Mittler punch. And these were flared so that they are adding strength even though they are taking away some weight. Once the radiator was in place, Trevor mounted a C&R heat exchanger. The heat exchanger is basically like a mini radiator that allows the coolant for the supercharger to release some of its heat, right? So when you start to look at the stack of coolers we have in the nose of this car, we've got our C&R Radiator, we've got our heat exchanger, and we also have the coil for the Vintage Air AC system. So these have electric fans on the radiator and on the heat exchanger, so we had to wire those up. They've also got plumbing going in and out of them for engine coolant, supercharger coolant, and the AC refrigerant. So Trevor had to make a bunch of brackets to mount all this stuff in the nose of the car and cleanly route all of the plumbing and the electrical wiring so that it didn't just look like a giant rat's nest in the front of the car. We're taking a lot of steps to make sure that when you open the hood of this car, it's very clean. We're trying to minimize the visible wiring and plumbing. So we're running a lot of the AC plumbing and cooling system plumbing underneath the passenger fender. So we relocated the receiver dryer unit for the air conditioning up to the firewall with some custom brackets. And because we make all of our own hoses in-house and crimp them to whatever length we want, we could extend those hoses and run them through the fender area. This car also uses a pump for the heat exchanger and supercharger coolant. So we got an upsized pump for increased flow. And we're using an electronic controller from a ZR1 Corvette. It's a pulse width modulated controller, and it's going to control the speed of the engine cooling fans pulling the air through the radiator. And with this controller, we can vary the speed of the fans based on the heat load, the engine load, if you got your foot to the floor, or if the car gets hot with the air conditioning on. And that's all, again, hidden inside the passenger fender. The engine in this car is very similar to what you find in a ZL1 Camaro. So we chose to run the coolant lines in and out of the supercharger, similar to what GM did on the ZL1. Theirs kind of take a 90-degree angle, and they've got some flexible hoses. We decided to run ours right out of the supercharger and into that cooler at the front of the engine, but we cleaned them up and made them symmetrical so that they look better. The last step was to kind of anchor all the plumbing so that the hoses are secure, and we wrap all of our electrical harnesses in a black Tech Flex sheath so that they look cool and they're also protected.